Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
We are in our third week of our series, Busy, reconnecting to an unhurried God. How do we reconnect to an unhurried God when we're busy, ignoring any kind of God? The first week of our series, we spoke on the yoke of God, coming from Matthew 11. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. From this first week, when we talked about the yoke of God, we weren't talking about how busyness is done away with, and so therefore you don't have to do anything. But rather, that the yoke that you take on is the yoke of God. And the yoke of God is different from being busy in the sense that it fits. It fits well and it suits you well. Not that you don't have to be in motion. You will be in motion. You will be engaged in living in the world. But the yoke fits. So therefore, it's not such a struggle to carry it. And it's not something that makes you grow weary, but something you live in joy of carrying. And then the next week, we talked about the hope of God. Through the Mary and Martha story in Luke, Jesus tells us, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken from her. This is the story about being distracted by our busyness, right? There's busyness in everything we do. The question is, what is your busyness leading toward? Is it leading toward distraction so that you don't have to really ask questions of meaning and purpose in life? Or is there busyness being about what it is you're called to be by the God who created you to be that? That's what Jesus is asking us in this question. Where is your busyness? Is it in distractions? Or is it in intentional attention to where God's active in the world and following that? This week we're working with Psalm 23, and we call this the assurance of God. This is where we talk about how God created us to engage with all of creation, with the still waters, the green pastures, and all the things that make us who we are and how we're in relationship to everything. But this is not about running away from life, but diving into the center of it. Taking the stillness from the rest of the green pastures and the still waters into the darkest valley of our lives, to live into the fullness of our humanity, assured that God is present with us, that God guides our way and directs our path through the rod and the staff. It's a corrective movement. It's not a punishment. It helps keep us on track and stay there in a way that helps us lead our lives and listen to God's voice in our lives rather than be distracted by some other voice. This is the assurance of God to be with us, not to run away from life, but to dive most deeply and most fully into the center of it. And leading life from the center of your life is exactly what the very first verse of the Psalm 23 asks us to do. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The power of this very first verse of this psalm is astonishing. Do you believe it? What if you did? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. What else do you need? What else is there to living in life but following the shepherd, listening to the voice of that who calls you out of your lostness and back into the herd and on the right path for God's sake? What more is there really? But can you believe it? Do you trust in it? Can you walk out these doors today and live your life differently because of the discovery of this? Maybe we should just stop the sermon right here and see if you can. All the kids are going, yeah. But even if you could drop all the expectations you have for your own life and sit and listen to the stillness of God and God's voice directing where your next motion comes from, would you actually hear it? Would you follow it? Would it change your way of being? How would it change the way you live your life? This is the question that the psalmist is asking us. Because it's not all green pastures out there, right? In here, in the peace and the 2 minutes that you have to sit and intentionally listen to God, when you walk out that door and the noise starts coming at you again, are you able to distinguish the peace within the busyness? The peace within the struggles? The psalmist continues to tell you that it's not all green pastures. It's not looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. But instead, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. This is not a rose-colored identity of living in the world. This is a real, common call to humanity, to life that comes with struggle, that comes with pain and despair and suffering and death. Because this psalm is not about comforting you in your death. It's about calling you into vigorous living, into abundant life. Because even though you walk through the darkest valley, you are bringing those green pastures and those still waters with you. God is present. God is attentive. God cares. God loves you. God is there with you. This is the assurance of God. This is how we walk into the darkest valley and face our fears. Not run away from them, but turn around and face them. Find a way through them, knowing that God is right there beside you. That's what the psalmist is getting us to look at today. And this past week, we have celebrated the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr. and his speech, I Have a Dream. It was 50 years ago that Martin Luther King Jr. walked with 250,000 people in a peaceful march on Washington concerning civil rights and civil liberties in this country. It was never before done in a nonviolent way in such a large group of people. And he didn't do this without enemies. He didn't do it without being busy. He did it knowing that God was with him in the midst of those struggles. In the midst of the busyness, he could find peace and rest in this assurance of God. And so he was very much like our psalmist for today. But resting in this assurance of God doesn't mean that you don't move. Dr. King, after having attended college and seminary, did his doctoral work at Boston University. He then became a pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. And by 1955, King led one of the very first nonviolent movements of its kind in the United States, the bus boycott. How many of you remember reading at least about the bus boycott, where there was segregation of buses? The blacks had to sit in the back of the bus and the whites could sit in the front. 382 days, black people rode the buses in the front to protest this segregation. And in the midst of those 382 days, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, his house was bombed, and he had to be subjected to personal abuse all along that way, as well as all those other people who rode those buses. 382 days that boycott went on, until finally, at the end of December in 1956, the United States government, or the Supreme Court, finally decided that all segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. He was subjected to all the pain and all the suffering and all the injustice that they all had to face during these 382 days, but he came out as a leader in the civil rights movement. And he started a movement that took all of its cues from Christianity and all of its organizational structure of nonviolence from Gandhi, and changed the way that we live with one another forever. This is hardly a green pasture life. This is a dark valley life that carries with it the assurance of the stillness of God, the love of God, and the presence of God in the midst of the struggle. Being busy doesn't mean you don't move, that you don't act. Letting go of your busyness and your distraction doesn't mean that you don't fully engage in life. It means, in fact, like Martin Luther King Jr., he traveled over 6 million miles in 11 years of ministry. He wrote 5 books and several articles. He planned one of the biggest protests in Alabama that led, in Birmingham specifically, that led to the letter from Birmingham jail. Remember that great speech? And then at the same time, while he was doing all that, he was creating and planning for voting registration drives throughout all of Alabama to get the black voters out and get their votes to count. And then in 1963, he directed that great march on Washington, D.C., and gave that wonderful, iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. He was not sitting still in the green pastures. He dove most fully into what it means to have a common humanity among all of us in our living. He counseled Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He was arrested over 20 times and assaulted at least 4 times. He was awarded 5 honorary degrees. He was named Man of the Year by Time magazine. And he was the youngest man to receive the Nobel Peace Prize at 35. He became a world leader. He was not sitting still. The absence of busyness is not sitting still. It's being actively attentive to the activity of God in the world and following that. Engaging life most fully at the most full allowance of our common humanity, that we may live together in the love and the assurance of God in the world and with all of creation. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to do. And he took that assurance of those still waters with him through all that turbulence, even into that night on April 4th, 1968, when he was in Memphis, preparing to lead a protest with the striking garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was assassinated. He didn't stop moving. He found the peace within the motion. He found the peace within the struggle, and calls all of us to our common humanity. That's what the psalm is all about. It's not about comfort in the dying as much as it's about the assurance of God in the midst of our living an abundant life, sure of green pastures, as sure as we can be of darkest valleys, assured that God is there too. The absence of busyness is not sitting still. Martin Luther King Jr.'s path was not busy. He was in motion all the time. And that struggle was not easy or light of burden because it was a blast and there was no conflict or no struggle. There was conflict and struggle all the way through it. What made it easy was that he was following his call from God. And he was constantly listening to the voice of God as it directed him and moved him in the right paths, as the psalmist says. Martin Luther King Jr. says it this way: the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's not an easy path. It's not without struggle. It's not just sitting still in the green pastures and never moving. The psalmist tells us that God creates us, is with us in the stillness and in the green pastures that gives us confidence and energy to move into the darkest valley of our living and carry that stillness with us and rest then in the assurance of God being with us in both the green pastures and the darkest valleys, so that our lives are most full and most abundant in our common humanity, sharing God's love. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends toward justice. It always involves God's love throughout the whole process. That's the assurance of God that the psalmist is sharing with us today. And you move through life day in, day by day, right? Through the fields of rest, through the conflict, and in the peace and the assurance of God in the midst of all that. No movement toward justice or liberation or freedom for your souls or full abundant living goes without struggle. Your story is connected to the larger story of God. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be struggle. It's part of what it means to be alive. But assured that you are created with God and God's rest and stillness and leading and guiding is with you throughout the journey. Finding that peace in the midst of the struggle is a very hard thing to do sometimes. Can you imagine sitting still in the middle of traffic? Where do you find your peace in the midst of the chaos? By listening to God's voice, leading you and guiding you. Because in verse 6 of this psalm, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. This is where the peace in the struggle is found. That covenantal language of God to be with us as we are always in God. It's a two-way relationship. Surely in goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. The word follow in that particular verse can also be translated to the word pursue. Think of how that word changes the sentence a bit in our own current language today. Surely goodness and mercy shall pursue me all the days of my life. That's God's job. To pursue us even when we're not paying attention. And our job is to dwell in the house of the Lord our whole lives long. a covenantal relationship that moves us through the green pastures and the still waters, through the darkest valleys and back around again, living most fully into humanity. Not all of us are called to be Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world. Not all of us are called to be the nonviolent, amazing icons like Gandhi in the world. We aren't called necessarily to preach sermons that are going to be remembered by generations to come. But we are all children of God. We are all called to be children of God, living into our humanity, our fullest humanity, listening to the voice of God as it guides us through our living together, so that as community, we can live in the midst of God's love and live most fully. Right here, right now, where we presently are, we are called by God in this psalm and in several other ways to be most fully who God created us to be, with the assurance that God is with us and will be with us, setting that table in the presence of our fears, our enemies, our struggles, that we may cross that barrier of what divides us from our enemies and our fears and move through it into abundant life. This psalmist is constantly asking the question, does your life call you to claim who and whose you are or not? Gandhi answered that question in a nonviolent way. Martin Luther King Jr. answered that question in a nonviolent, assured way that God is with. How do you answer that question? What does your life look like? When you walk through this door, taking that assurance of God with you, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. How does that change your life? How does it call you to a life that claims who and whose you are? Tex Sample is a pastor who was a part of the movements of Martin Luther King Jr., and he was one of the folks who walked from Selma to Montgomery in the midst of the voter registration protests. And Tex Sample does a really good job, I think, of answering this question about claiming who he is and whose he is. And he tells his own story through a video I'd like to share with you.
In 1965, a group of civil rights demonstrators were met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by the police, who violently attacked them. That demonstration led Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to call for a march from Selma to Montgomery in behalf of voting rights legislation then before the U.S. Congress. So a march began from Selma to Montgomery. At the time, I was a social action executive for the Massachusetts Council of Churches. My job was to help organize and send people to that march. But I and others at the Mass Council joined the march on the day before the last day. We were driven to the site of the march after we arrived at the airport, and I spent the night on my raincoat on the ground at the St. Jude Catholic Complex. That next morning, we began that last phase of the march into Montgomery. A decision had been made that when we approached Montgomery, we would take a jog to go through the black community as a show of solidarity and support. I was on the outside and looked down the line of march, and as we were walking along, I could see an African American woman coming up the line of march, counter to our direction. She looked to be a woman who had known a lot of poverty. Her dress had been washed many 2 times. Her shoes were old and well worn. But in one hand, she had a gallon jug of Kool-Aid, and in the other, she had 6 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I don't know why, but when she got to me, She shoved those sandwiches into one of my hands and that gallon jug of Kool-Aid in the other. And then she looked at me and said, "Hell, brother, we're going to overcome." Well, when I looked back up the line of march, she had gone. But I took one of those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, passed them to the person next to me in the line. Then I took that gallon jug of Kool-Aid. I was always proud that I knew how to drink from a jug. Then I handed that to the person next to me in the line, and it just hit me. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood which is shed for you and for many. That remains the most powerful Eucharistic moment of my life. I chilled for a mile after that, and we continued that march on into Montgomery. Once there, in the front of the Capitol, we began a long demonstration. And there we all sat down on the grass, thousands of us. As usual, we had singers and musicians. We had speeches. It was a rousing time together. And yet we all waited for Dr. King because we knew he would bring the message that would close out the event. Finally, the time came for Dr. King's speech. I still regard that speech in Montgomery as the equal of the one that he had made in Washington in 1963. And when Dr. King enters into the last part of that speech, he began a kind of a call and response with himself initially. He shouts out, "How long?" And he responds to himself, "Not long." How long? Not long. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because while the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. How long? Not long. Then he shouted at us, "How long?" And those thousands of people got up off the ground and on their feet and shouted back, "Not long." It would be 3 years before his body would be broken and his blood would be shed. But as long as I live, I shall never forget that wonderful black woman shoving the elements of the Eucharist into my hands and then proclaiming, "Hell, brother, we're going to overcome."